Hey guys, buckle up because what I'm about to tell you might just ruin your all too rosy image of medieval courtship. Think dragons and knightly valor. Sure, but also sweaty, awkward, borderline bizarre sexcapades that would make even the steamiest modern romance seem tame. Yeah, medieval sex was less Hollywood happy ending and more puzzle wrapped in a medieval mystery, full of weird rules, strange rituals, and enough superstition to make you wonder if people really knew how to get it on, or just thought they were doing some kind of ancient spell. So, before you picture chivalrous knights and stuffy queens, hit like if you love dirty secrets from history, and let me know, would you survive a medieval love quest, dim the lights, get cozy, or maybe uncomfortable? Because we're diving into what sex was actually like back when the only thing better than a love potion was a lot of confused consent. In a dusty, bustling market town of the 12th century, young Tomas sat at his wooden desk, quill in hand, under the flickering light of a nearby candle. The streets echoed with the low hum of merchants hawking their wares, and the scent of baked bread mingled with the aroma of fresh herbs. Tomas's thoughts drifted between his learning and the quiet hope that one day he might find companionship beyond the mortal hours confined by duty and doctrine. Nearby, Alin, the innkeeper's daughter, moved with a slow, familiar rhythm, dusting mugs and exchanging brief, knowing glances with passing townsfolk. The air felt thick with unspoken longing, layered beneath the soft banter and the ever-present shadow of the church's teachings touching every corner of their lives. Here, in this small world of simple routines, intimacy was both a gentle hope and a fragile, lawful whisper acknowledged only in quiet moments. As seasons changed, the everyday hum carried a quieter tension, bound by the rigid laws of faith and feudal obligation, where even love had to navigate the narrow pathways approved by church and crown. Tomas found himself stealing glances at Alin, whose cheeks often flushed in secret. Yet both understood that desire was a delicate thing, a fragile whisper pressed against centuries of doctrine. The townsfolk spoke little about such matters, their conversations carefully hedged around the unspoken rules, and when festivals arrived, they danced and feasted within boundaries that felt both comforting and constrictive. The church's teachings appeared like a shadow that stretched across their lives, powerful, unseen, and quietly relentless, imposing morality upon moments that perhaps only wished to be simple, honest, human. Still, amid the silent tensions, faint smiles lingered, flickering like candle flames just before they flicker out. There was a quiet irony in how the community celebrated its festivals, vivid, lively gatherings that, beneath their warmth, often concealed clutches of whispered rules and forbidden curiosities. Tomas, sitting beside a Lynn during a communal feast, noticed how the flickering torches cast shadows that blurred faces, hiding the secret glances exchanged under a canopy of starless sky. The church's figures, their faces blurred and shadowed, loomed in the background of these moments, their unseen presence a constant reminder that even celebration carried a hidden weight of morality. The simple act of sharing bread and wine could seem both sacred and mundane, an affirmation of life pressed down by layers of law and belief. Yet, in these quiet exchanges, there was a strange kind of humility, a recognition that human longing persisted quietly beneath the weight of doctrine. After the festival's end, the town settled into a gentle calm, where the sounds of laughter softened into the hush of late evening. Tomas and Aline found comfort in shared silences, their hands brushing momentarily over rough wooden surfaces, feeling the slow, deliberate pulse of ordinary life. The church's influence softened into a distant, almost poetic memory as they relaxed into the mundane moments of everyday life, fetching water, mending clothes, whispering stories in the dark. Their hopes remained gentle, tucked away behind everyday routines that made life feel both ordinary and quietly meaningful. In these calm hours, the presence of unseen figures, prophets and rulers, alike faded into the shadows, leaving space for the humbling, imperfect beauty of human existence. It was a slow, deliberate kind of peace, nestled in the cracks of shared daily life. In reflecting on these years, it became clear that the true story of love and intimacy in medieval times was threaded through quiet resilience and subtle humor, rather than grand declarations or fervent promises. Tomas continued to write, his words often lost among the everyday realities of a life lived under law and faith. And Aline's laughter still carried a softness that defied the shadows of doctrine. The faces of saints and prophets remained blurred and indistinct, as if watching from a distance cloaked in light, while human life flowed in small, imperfect slices of time, bound by rules, but never entirely subdued. Perhaps in the end, it was the mundane, the overlooked moments, a shared glance, a whispered joke, a gentle touch that made the small, slow story of love sweeter than any decree or doctrine could contain. And in those quiet hours, everyone found a way to carry the truth of their own imperfect humanity. In the quiet hours of medieval life, behind the murmurs of daily chores and the faint glow of candlelight, there lingers a subtle curiosity about love and intimacy. Tomas, a young scribe, sat in the dim corner of the monastery's cloister, carefully unrolling a leather-bound manuscript. Its pages, fragile and yellowed, whispered about courtly love an idealized, distant notion that seemed almost detached from everyday hardship. For the first time, he glimpsed a world where desire was penned in secret, where poets and troubadours tried to capture fleeting feelings in poetry and song, often blurred by the shadows of morality. As he traced the inked words, a quiet sense of awe mingled with a gentle, almost amused recognition of human longing, woven into the fabric of a society keen on order. Meanwhile, Alin, a local villager, learned of a hidden network, those clandestine meetings known among the village youth as the Greenwood Trysts. Under the canopy of trees, couples slipped away from the watchful eyes of priests and elders, seeking moments of tenderness that could not be openly spoken of. The air there carried the faint scent of moss and damp earth, contrasting sharply with the formalities of church and town square. The irony was gentle. These lovers, by day obedient citizens, found private solace in the wild, where boundaries dissolved beneath the shade. Yet, even in these secret gatherings, there was a quiet tension, a longing to reconcile secret desire with the strict moral bounds that framed their lives. Their discreet struggles echoed the broader human theme of yearning, quietly shadowed by duty, as stories of secret trysts and written verses circulated. A faint humor arose around the contradictions that emerge when human affection attempts to slip past the watchful eyes of authority. Perhaps it was the image of a burly farmer clutching a simple bouquet of wildflowers, sneaking past the village church at dusk, or a young couple awkwardly positioning themselves behind a tangled hedge. The poetry and clandestine meetings, while serious in intent, often carried an unconscious irony. How lovers sought intimacy in places most easily overlooked or dismissed. The small gestures, the nervous glances, the hurried touches, all unfolded in scenes painfully mundane, yet quietly defiant. Even amid the seriousness, an amused acknowledgement about human folly must have echoed softly among those who observed it all. Gradually, a sense of calm settled over the stories, perhaps from the passing of seasons or the acceptance of human imperfection. In the glow of twilight, villagers moved about their routines, eyes flickering with quiet understanding about the private worlds that existed alongside their public masks. Tomas, having uncovered the manuscript, reflected on how love persisted beyond written words, while Alin appreciated the silent resilience of those secretly longing beneath the canopy of trees. The shadows of the church and the barely seen faces of prophets remained unseen, their faces blurred by the light that fell unevenly across the town. In this stillness, there was a gentle acknowledgement of humanity's persistent, if often quiet, search for connection, even when couched in secrecy and mild irony. In the end, the story of medieval love, both penned in secret manuscripts and enacted in hidden woods, reveals the universal tension between private desire and social bounds. Everyone, it seems, carries a quiet wish to slip beyond the day's plain routines into something more intimate and real, however fleeting or fragile that may be. The human landscape, with its modest gestures and softly amused ironies, remains remarkably unchanged across ages. As a visitor to this distant world, one senses that beneath all the official structures and moral codes, the fundamental ache to love and be loved quietly endures. Part of what it means to be human, quietly persistent and beautifully imperfect. In the slow, fading light of the medieval court, Thomas and Aline sat in a quiet chamber, the hum of everyday life softly slipping through the thick stone walls. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of ink and old parchment as documents were quietly signed or folded away. It was an ordinary evening, but beneath the routine, a subtle shift of tension had begun, whispered rumors of a mistress caught in a delicate web of shame. Their world, familiar and unchanging, was subtly unraveling, suddenly touched by the fragile thread of scandal that threatened to pull everything into sharper focus. Yet, even as the shadows lengthened, it all remained painfully human, a moment suspended, eyes searching for constellations that would never quite align. As news of the mistress's indiscretion spread, the weight of the impending trial pressed upon Thomas and Aline. They watched as officials prepared the wooden planks and writs, the stained parchment and inkpots resting quietly on the desk, silent witnesses to the coming judgment. The church's voice echoed stiffly in the corridors, words about morality and sin punctuated by the faint scrape of quills. Thomas felt a coldness crawling up his spine, while Aline's hands trembled just slightly as she clutched her ladle. Yet they knew, as most did, that the penalty for fornication was harsh, often met with penance or exile. The warning lay behind the thick, carved doors, a reminder that the law had little room for mercy. Once moral lines had been crossed in sacred or secular eyes, a sense of irony drifted through the proceedings, as the clergy in their robes and solemn faces seemed both distant and oddly familiar, almost as if they too were caught in a slow, endless dance of double standards. Here were the powerful, protected by wealth and influence, often skirting the very laws they publicly upheld, their faces blurred by the shadow of hypocrisy. Meanwhile, the lower townsfolk watched from a distance, their whispers lost in the creak of the heavy chains of tradition. Thomas noted how the same faces that judged could also be unseen by judgment, their blurred features like shadows in the flickering candlelight. The absurdity was palpable, a system designed to shame, yet often shielding those who could afford the silence. A quiet, ironic ballet of justice and privilege. Eventually, the trial reached a calm, almost meditative pause, where the charges were laid bare and sentences gently handed down in measured tones. The heavy, slow ticking of a nearby clock seemed to echo the quiet resignation of a society weary of moral chaos. Tomas and Aline watched as penitence was prescribed kneeling. Prayers whispered into the vast, empty space, hands pressed together as if holding back the tide of shame. Yet beneath it all, a quiet sense of acceptance settled in. The world continued turning, the mild hum of daily life pressing on. And in that calm, the human imperfections lingered, a reminder that, in the end, societies adapt, and morality often drifts quietly along with the murmur of everyday routines. Reflecting later, Tomas and Aline understood that these moments of public judgment were less about morality and more about the enduring human tendency to seek order amidst chaos. The petty rituals of penance and punishment, woven into the fabric of daily life, concealed the more enduring truths, our imperfections, shared fears, and the silent irony that privilege often masks. The faces of prophets or saints remained obscured, their images blurred by the light of passing days, reminders that divine judgment was as elusive as the human need for justice. As they moved quietly back into their routines, there was a gentle recognition. Perhaps not much had changed, except that society learned to carry its contradictions more quietly. Like a beloved, slightly worn book resting on a well-loved shelf in the quiet corners of medieval villages, life moved along with understated routines, women husking grains, men tending cattle, and the occasional glance exchanged in the marketplace. Amidst this unhurried rhythm, Tomas and Aline found themselves crossing paths more often, their conversations slow and tentative, woven into the daily tapestry of survival and small pleasures. The looming shadow of the Black Death had not yet fully cast over their land, but whispers of illness stirred a distant unease, softening the usual boundaries of social decorum. Their shared smiles, subtle and tentative, carried a quiet thrill, an unspoken acknowledgement that perhaps the ordinary could become something more fleeting, more vivid. The air was warm with late afternoon light filtering through wooden shutters, gently touching the worn faces of those who dared to hope for normalcy amidst uncertainty. As news of the plague spread, fear seeped into the undercurrents of village life, loosening ingrained rules and social restraints that had long defined proper conduct. Tomas and Aline, now finding their meetings more clandestine, sought refuge in hidden corners or abandoned chapels, where the world's noise seemed to fade into shadows. In this fragile silence, they briefly forgot the weight of their circumstances, their hands trembling as they clasped, seeking reassurance in touch rather than words. The crumbling stones of the chapel provided a quiet sanctuary, even as the outside threatened to burst apart with unrest and loss. Their quiet union, born of necessity and desperation, momentarily blurred the distinctions between moral duty and instinct, steering their longing into an uncertain, almost reckless tenderness. Ironically, as the intimacy deepened, the absurdity of their situation became more apparent. An act so fragile, so touched by the danger outside, that it risked becoming a story no one would believe. The flicker of candlelight revealed their flushed faces, framed by shadows that blurred their features into gentle masks of human fragility. Their hurried breaths echoed softly against the ancient stone, mingling with distant sounds of church bells, and hurried footsteps outside, their secret very much contained within the slow, silent hours. It was a strange mix of urgency and patience, driven by the absurd hope that amidst illness and decay, they could cling to this fleeting moment of shared humanity. And yet, in the quiet, there was a strange comfort in the recognition that perhaps everything, even desire, was as vulnerable as the fragile chapel walls. Eventually, the fever of their secret ended, and a calm settled back upon Tomas and Aline, as the plague's immediate threat seemed to ebb and flow like the tide. They returned to their routines, their gestures now unmarked by the rush of clandestine longing, settling into the slow, mundane rhythm of daily life. The chapel remained silent, its stones holding the faint echo of their brief union, an invisible imprint of human softness amid the harshness of history. Their quiet story, like many others, drifted into the background noise of a world struggling to survive. Shadows stretched long across the village streets as dusk fell, quietly reminding them that even in chaos, life persisted in small, unremarkable ways, languid, imperfect, human. Looking back, the episode in the ruined chapel becomes just another muted thread in the long, slow tapestry of human endurance. Tomas and Aline's fleeting encounter reflects a universal truth that even in the midst of crisis, desire and companionship find their quiet place, often hidden beneath layers of practicality and fear. Their story, unremarkable on the surface, holds a subtle irony. The most profound human moments often occur just outside the bounds of what history remembers, tucked away in the simple act of standing close when the world seems to fall apart. As the centuries pass, those small acts of connection retain a quiet dignity, a gentle reminder that amidst the stories of plagues and wars, it's human softness that quietly endures, and perhaps in that enduring softness there is a kind of silent victory over the relentless march of time. In the quiet corners of medieval chambers, couples would meet under faint candlelight, their movements slow and deliberate, each touch carrying the weight of routine and hope. The air was often thick with a mix of linen and honeyed perfumes, as the day's labors faded into whispered routines. It was a time when the concept of romance was intertwined with duty and social expectation, leaving passion to flicker quietly beneath layers of obligation, feet crossed in modest restraint, eyes sometimes meeting for a fleeting moment, men and women molded by the predictable rhythm of their existence. And so, amid the simple acts of closeness, history's silent observers might sense the human longing tucked between the folds of conformity. Yet, beneath the surface of these outward formalities, the landscape of love and desire was far more varied than it first appeared. Marital duties, often layered into acts of pragmatic necessity, while some sought companionship beyond the rigid bonds of marriage in the shadows of taverns or the company of concubines. Across courts and rural villages alike, arrangements could be as strategic as they were passionate, a reflection of power, wealth, and social standing. It was not uncommon for individuals to navigate their desires with careful discretion, aware that a wrong move could shatter fragile alliances or reputation. The slow ache of unspoken longing lingered in many hearts, quietly blending devotion with subtle frustration. Ironically, some of the most quietly revolutionary acts were preserved in folk rituals, where whispered traditions celebrated bonds that defied contemporary norms. Small gatherings might include secret games or symbolic rites, evoking a sense of shared identity that subtly challenged the monotony of official doctrine. Among these, same-sex bonds sometimes found a haven in the lull of storytelling and shared memory, their existence recorded faintly by chroniclers who found humor or irony in the discreet ways humans expressed longing. The faces of prophets and holy figures, often blurry and hidden behind veils of light, seemed to watch quietly from the margins, indifferent to the human stories unfolding beneath. These unspoken stories added a thread of complexity, reminding us that even in constrained times, desire and friendship found quiet ways to persist. Calm settled over the landscape of human intimacy as the centuries wove forward, as if time itself had resigned to the slow dance of tradition and change. Daily routines, knitting, tending to livestock, or sharing bread, brought a gentle rhythm that relieved the static tension of hidden longing. Occasionally, the mundane became poetic, like a woman's hand trembling slightly as she brushed her hair, or a man's voice cracking over a folk tune. In these simple acts, the quiet humanity persisted, flawed, imperfect, and quietly triumphant. The faces of those who had come before seemed to blur further in the golden light of twilight, their stories slipping into quiet observance, as if history itself was content to watch and bear witness. Ultimately, Tomas's chronicle emerges as a careful mosaic, one that captures the nuanced reality of medieval sexuality without the need for grand judgments, just a gentle reminder of how humans long to connect. In this muted archive, devotion, power, and human longing intertwine, each story layered softly into the next, like notes in a lullaby. Perhaps in that slow, reflective way, we find a kind of salvation, an understanding that, despite centuries of difference, the quiet ache for intimacy remains a shared human mystery. As the light dims further on this distant past, it leaves behind the gentle echo of stillness, reminding us that history is not only made of actions, but also of enduring, whispered desires. On a gentle morning in the village of Saint Marcel, the cobblestone streets echoed quietly with the steps of market vendors arranging their stalls. Elinor, the daughter of a humble weaver, watched from her small window, her eyes drifting to the colorful banners being hung, and the faint smell of fresh bread filling the air as villagers prepared for the annual feast. Her heart fluttered softly at the prospect of the coming day, though she hardly expected that a stranger's gaze would settle on her in such a mundane moment. The world felt slow and slightly distant, a little bit worn around the edges, as routine and history intertwined in a calendar that didn't care much for change. Life, at its quiet core, was simple, yet somehow Elinor sensed that this day might shift something unspoken beneath its calm surface. When the midday sun cast a warm, diffuse light over the square, Elinor found herself deliberately near the edge of the crowd, where a young squire named Roland tried to cloak his nerves behind a hesitant smile. Their eyes met amid the lull of chatter, and for a few suspended seconds, the usual hum of voices faded into background noise. Roland's hands, calloused yet trembling slightly, pressed to his belt as he struggled to find words, while Elinor's cheeks warmed in the rare, curious comfort of unspoken connection. Yet external shadows loomed, families whispering about marriages arranged with the wealthiest suitors, and her mother's quiet reminder that her future was already promised to another. A subtle irony hung, as the universe seemed to insist on familiarity, paired with the inescapable weight of duty. As the afternoon wore on, and the village's festive spirit gathered momentum, it became clear that the brief spark between Elinor and Roland was not going unnoticed. Whispers drifted like faint smoke, hushed between old friends and bustling merchants who had seen countless seasons pass unnoticed. Alina, aware of her own reputation and the unspoken expectations, could not help but feel a wry amusement at the human comedy unfolding. A scene stitched together from longing and resignation, played out beneath the careless eye of time. Roland, meanwhile, smiled with a softness that betrayed no certainty, as if the distant promise of knighthood might somehow grant him courage to challenge the slow, persistent march of tradition. Life was, after all, a series of quiet ironies gently unfolding in the corners of the everyday. By evening, the village settled into a gentle lull. Faint lantern light flickered against weathered wood, and the warmth from the hearths softly filled the cool air. Alina sat with her family, her hands resting on her lap, watching the distant figures of villagers swapping stories and laughter. The pretense of innocence persisted as her mind replayed the brief connection with Roland, now tinged with a strange sense of peace. The tense anticipation of conflict, of choices pressed into her in silent, invisible ink, seemed to melt into the background noise of daily life, calm, unremarkable, yet quietly meaningful. Perhaps, she thought, the world was content with small acts of defiance, tucked away in quiet moments and uncertain dreams, waiting for their own subtle dawn. As she lay in her simple bed later that night, Alina reflected on the day with a gentle smile. No grand resolutions, no sweeping declarations, just the soft understanding that life's true stories often unfolded in slow, unnoticed ways. The promise of the village fair, of fleeting glances and whispered hopes, drifted into the silence like a leaf on still water. Somewhere beyond the shadow of duty, a quiet, human tenderness lingered, imperfect and fragile, yet enough to remind her of the small, enduring truths that made each day worth the quiet watch. In this slow moment, amidst the gentle weight of history and hope, she found a gentle peace in simply being part of something unfolding, unhurried and human. In the quiet villages of the Middle Ages, young lovers like Roland and Alina navigated the slow currents of courtship beneath the watchful eyes of tradition. While Roland rode off to distant campaigns, Alina found small moments of solace in the simple act of sewing, where hidden within the hems of her linens, concealed from prying eyes, she kept delicate letters. These notes carried poetry, soft promises, and hopes that flickered like fragile candlelight in the dark. Subtle acts of devotion that defied the strict codes surrounding chaperoned meetings. The air was often thick with the smell of wax and linen, and the distant clang of armor or the call of peasant voices occasionally punctuated the quiet intimacy. It was an era, both careful and hurried, where even love's quiet whispers had to hide behind layers of cloth and cautious breath. As Roland's military duties grew more demanding, the exchange of these clandestine letters became a tense dance of patience and discreet courage. Alina would fold her careful script into tiny scrolls, slipping them into the hems of her linens, praying that her delicate secret wouldn't unravel in the wash or be discovered by curious eyes. Each word was weighed with a mix of longing and fear, knowing that a misstep could bring scandal or worse, loss of reputation for both. Outside, the world moved slowly. The sun shifted lazily over stone walls and thatched roofs, indifferent to the quiet dramas stitched into each letter's fabric. Sometimes the only sound was the faint rustling of linen as Alina shifted her hand, feeling the weight of unspoken sentiments. Delight and dread intertwined in the slow rhythm of their secret courtship. Fragile as spun gold, irony played quietly in their hidden exchanges. The very act that quickened their hearts also risked turning their world upside down. Sending poetry via concealed scrolls within garments was an act both daring and absurd. A small rebellion in a rigid society that frowned on unaccompanied woman and man. Once, Alina nearly lost a letter when the maid accidentally washed her linen with the day's laundry, the words dissolving like mist. Their carefully crafted clandestine messages often bordered on the poetic, filled with allusions to stars, rivers, and the distant horizon, symbols meant to speak beyond the reach of prying eyes. It was humorous in its quiet absurdity. That love could be so confined, so carefully secreted away within the humble folds of household linens. Each letter, a tiny act of rebellion wrapped in mundane textures, underscored the slow, relentless patience of human longing. Over time, as seasons changed and Roland returned briefly from campaigns, the weight of their secret softened into a gentle calm. Alina's fingers would trace the hem of her linens and recall the scrawled words of affection, her cheeks warm with quiet hope. They learned to accept the slow, subtle pace of their affair, finding comfort in fleeting visits, shared meals, and the gentle touch of handwritten words. The clandestine letters, once fraught with tension, now seemed to drift like muted echoes, part of a fragile human story enduring beneath layers of duty and societal gaze. Their hearts, quiet but resilient, found a quiet rhythm in the mundane act of waiting, a reminder that even in the slowest stories, something quietly keeps beating. The world around them remained indifferent, but within, a small universe of love persisted, slow and real. Looking back, their story feels like a quiet snapshot of human perseverance, love, after all, often unfolds in the margins, unseen and understated. The secret letters hidden in linen hems are a testament to the small acts of intimacy endured despite strict boundaries and silent rules. Perhaps, in some distant corner of history, their whispered promises survived not through grand declarations, but through the unassuming, patient weave of everyday life. Their story embraces the slow, the mundane, the imperfect, reminding us that even the most quiet human acts hold a quiet dignity. As they aged, the secret journeys of those hidden words seemed to dissolve into memory, leaving only a gentle echo of the enduring human need for connection. In the end, it was perhaps not the words themselves, but the slow, silent hope that quietly persisted in the background that defined their story. In the quiet village, Alina sat by her window as the seasons gentle pushed and pulled at the worn wood frame. The rustle of recent conversations about marriage and reputation drifted through the air, unnoticed but persistent. Her family, with their thoughtful glances and subtle nods, seemed to regard her future as already preordained. Like an old thread woven into the fabric of village life, a soft wind carried the faint scent of bread baking, and for a moment, Alina felt the slow pulse of her own quiet hopes. It was a day like so many before, where the ordinary rhythm of life subtly hid the stories of longing and expectation beneath a calm exterior. Then, unexpectedly, Count Lucian arrived at the village, his arrival announced by a carriage's distant clatter and the hurried shifting of servants' feet. His proposal was lavish, a chest of gold, fine cloth, promises of noble shelter. But Alina felt the weight of this generosity as a sudden, cold question pressed against her. Could happiness be measured in riches? Her family's faces wore the familiar veneer of approval, yet behind those eyes, a flicker of eager expectation. The community murmured their silent judgments, their opinions swirling like a slow, persistent tide. Alina's heart, uncertain and quietly restless, wondered how much of her own story was already written in the shimmering promises of wealth. Amidst the growing tension, the village priest, with a face blurred by shadow and a voice softened by age, suggested a different trial, this one of faith rather than wealth. He handed Alina a small, simple prayer book and spoke of a pilgrimage to Saint Genevieve's shrine, where she could seek clarity amidst the quietness of her steps. The irony was delicate. Whether love endured these spiritual tests or simply faded into the background was difficult to tell. Alina observed the weary expressions of those who had taken similar paths, their steps slow and grounded. Outside, the sky gray and unassuming seemed to acknowledge the unspoken truth. Some journeys required more patience than certainty. As Alina prepared for her pilgrimage, a peaceful calm settled over her thoughts, like a gentle afternoon breeze. She packed a small bag, feeling the rough texture of the cloth against her fingers, and stepped outside where the village's familiar sights stretched quietly around her. The process was ordinary, the simple act of walking away from home, but imbued with a subtle sense of purpose that felt both fragile and resilient. The village children played in the distance, unaware of her silent journey, their laughter drifting through the still air. Alina recognized that perhaps, in these small, unremarkable moments, there was a quiet strength, a pause where love and faith could coexist without grand declarations or dramatic gestures. Sitting alone in the shadowed sanctuary of the shrine, Alina realized that the trial of her heart was less about the destination and more about the slow unfolding of her own quiet thoughts. The faces of prophets and saints, blurred and hidden behind a diffuse glow, seemed to invite her to see the sacred in small moments, the patience of waiting, the acceptance of uncertainty, the gentle persistence of hope. Her journey was a reminder that human stories often moved at the pace of a slow breath, full of mundane details, subtle ironies, and fleeting glimpses of clarity. As she made her way homeward, the village's familiar outlines softened into a gentle, almost humorous backdrop for her small, ongoing piece of human absurdity and grace. Under the gentle glow of the setting sun, Alina and Roland found themselves beneath the ancient oak, its gnarled branches like quiet witnesses to history. Their softly exchanged vows lingered in the cool air, each promise folding into the next with a calm sincerity that felt both fragile and earnest. The meadow around them was silent, except for a distant bird's call, almost as if the world had agreed to hold its breath in their private moment. Their hands, slightly trembling, met beneath the shade, as if to seal something unseen but deeply felt. It was a small act amidst centuries of bygone days, but for them it was everything they could afford to claim amidst the slow unfolding of life. Time seemed to pass with a muted tempo until the quiet of the meadow was disturbed by the crunching footsteps of approaching men, Count's men, their armor faintly clinking in the dusk. The tranquility shattered as weapons were subtly shifted, eyes cautious and voices lowered, yet their intent was palpable. Alina and Roland's whispered vows dissolved into a tense silence. Their gaze exchanged one lingering look of resignation and longing. Their secret celebration, once a delicate thread spun with hope, now felt precariously strained, threatened by the weight of authority and the silent judgment of unseen witnesses in the shadows. The moment hung suspended, caught between personal devotion and the broader edicts that governed their lives. Despite the seriousness that clouded their meeting, there was an odd sense of irony threading through the scene. How especially human love, in all its quiet defiance and simplest acts, could be both so fragile and so resolute. The soldiers, stoic and unknowing, missed the faint smile that flickered on Aliner's lips, or the fleeting softness in Roland's dark eyes. Their confrontation, calm in its form, but heavy in implication, was almost like a mundane pause in what might otherwise be an ordinary evening. Flesh and metal whispered threats, and the faint aroma of wildflowers. The irony was that amidst this tension, life went on. People still loved, hoped, and whispered promises beneath the watchful shadows of medieval authority. As the soldiers eventually withdrew, their heavy boots fading into the distance, the meadow settled into an almost tranquil quiet again, as if the world had briefly exhaled after holding its breath. Aliner and Roland, shoulders relaxed, but hearts heavy with unspoken fears, lingered beside the ancient oak, their hands slowly loosening from their secret hold. The dusk deepened into a calm that resembled the stillness of countless nights before ordinary, slow, and quietly enduring. Their youthful hope, slightly battered but not extinguished, carried them gently back from the edge of exposure into the soft night air, where mundane realities reasserted their gentle dominance over fleeting moments of love and defiance. Later, as shadows lengthened and the stars quietly emerged, one might reflect on the unremarkable yet quietly momentous nature of such histories. How simple acts like vows beneath a tree can carry the weight of worlds, or at least two people's worlds. Aliner and Roland's evening was less a story of grand romance than a glimpse into the everyday persistence of human longing amid the slow, inevitable tide of time and authority. Their silent, tentative promises, fragile as old leaves, served as quiet reminders that even in the most subdued moments, human beings seek connection that somehow makes their short time here significant, if only for a little while. And in the slow unfolding of their night, perhaps they knew that some small defiance, quietly kept, is often enough to carry them through another day. In the muted hours of a late medieval afternoon, Aliner and Roland's quietly arranged courtship began amid the simple sounds of a village hen's clucking, the faint rustle of linen, and the distant chime of a bell. Their eyes met behind the modest walls of the abbey, where hopes and doubts lingered like a faint, almost unnoticed scent on the wind. It was an era when love was often spoken in exchanged glances and subtle gestures rather than grand declarations, and their budding affection carried a fragile tenderness that dared not make too much noise. Yet, even in its quietude, there was a sense that something essential was unfolding, an ordinary kind of extraordinary hope, though no one quite knew how it might survive the weight of tradition. So, beneath the dimming light, the two souls moved gently closer, with cautious, genuine moments of connection. As weeks passed, the whispers of their affection grew like a slow, gentle ripple through the village, catching the attention of those who valued propriety and the sacred customs they respected. Familial elders and neighbors observed with a mixture of curiosity and cautious approval. Surprisingly, for once, the village eyes seemed a little softer and more hesitant, as if recognizing that love, however modest, still held the power to unsettle even the most anchored traditions. Still, practical concerns arose. Would the abbey's rules or the ecclesiastical authorities permit such a union? Rumors fluttered like moths around flickering candlelight, and Alina and Roland's quiet hope was shadowed by the persistent uncertainty of formal approval. It was an unspoken tension, woven quietly into the everyday fabric of their lives, holding the fragile possibility of union just beyond reach. The irony of the situation settled gently. Their sincere love, simple as it was, faced a bureaucratic maze with uncertain chances, an obstacle course of papal dispensations, ecclesiastical statutes, and societal expectations that seemed both distant and oddly personal. A day arrived when they sought the advice of the abbot, whose face was obscured in shadow and light, as if the sacred figures themselves preferred to remain unseen, leaving only the resonance of measured words. The abbot listened, nodding slowly, perhaps amused at the human folly of trying to formalize what was naturally felt. They sent their plea to the higher authorities, knowing well that such matters often moved at the pace of a slow, contemplative river, little affected by urgency, but susceptible to patience and persistence. And so, the quiet negotiations continued, punctuated by small acts of hope and polite indifference. At last, some days later, a soft, almost reluctant nod from the distant papal office arrived, an obscure parchment granting their union a special dispensation, allowing Alina and Roland to marry despite the usual barriers. The village celebrated their small victory with a modest gathering, an unassuming feast of bread, cheese, and soft-spoken joy, as if the everyday rhythm had finally caught up with a quiet dream. Their wedding day was filled with the gentle sounds of shared laughter and tender touches, set against the backdrop of a sky turning a muted orange as evening arrived. Amid this calm, Alina and Roland found themselves enveloped in a serene, almost bemused sense of relief, realizing that their patience and quiet hope had carved a small space in the vast, slow-moving machinery of tradition. It was nothing dramatic, but perhaps that was enough. Reflecting on their journey, the story of Alina and Roland whispered softly through the village, a reminder that love's endurance often lies in its modest, unembellished persistence, even with the faint irony that their union was facilitated by unseen figures behind blurred faces. The human truth remained. Hope and kindness could bend even the most rigid customs, if only gently enough. As they settled into their new life, it became clear that the true value of their story was in its quiet affirmation. That union based on affection, honor, and patience could, in its own slow way, leave a gentle footprint through the centuries. Sitting under the same softly lit sky, they shared a look full of gentle humor and quiet gratitude, knowing well that the future might still be uncertain. But for now, it was enough to be simply together in the gentle light of a mid-morning sun filtering through small, leaded glass windows. Isolde sat quietly beside her parents, the air thick with the scent of stale ale and warm bread. The village's feudal lord had carefully laid out the terms of her future, an agreement crafted long before her own understanding, sealed with wax and solemn promises. Her eyes flicked toward Sir Roland, the seasoned knight whose broad shoulders looked both weathered and reassuring, yet whose expression was obscured behind a faint blur of light on his face. Outside, the sounds of cows lowing and children's distant laughter melded into a dull, familiar hum, as if life crept forward with unhurried patience. The day crackled quietly with the weight of tradition. No fireworks, no shouts, only the slow, deliberate ticking of a world that considered marriage a matter of lands, duties, and quiet hope. As the seasons turned and Isolde approached her wedding day, the air grew heavier with unspoken tension. The legal contract lay shadowed on the table, thick parchment, with lines written in dark ink edges curling slightly with age, and a space for her mark that felt increasingly distant. The church's voice, muffled yet persistent, demanded her consent, but her young mind grasped the passing irony. Years of careful negotiations and dowries to ensure a union. Yet no promise could truly reach her own quiet hopes or whispered dreams. Sir Roland's lined face bore the mark of countless battles, and his eyes, partially hidden, seemed to reflect the inevitable quiet gravity of law and expectation. The world around them moved slowly, a steady rhythm of solemn vows and economic necessity, turning desire into an afterthought at the altar of lineage and land. Then came the irony, how the very law meant to protect and formalize their union often felt like an elaborate, bemused joke. The bright blue ribbons that tied her dress were like tiny anchors, binding her not just to her future husband, but to the centuries-old codes that dictated her choices. Sir Roland's hand, rough yet insistent, pressed upon hers during the ceremony, the small touch both tender and burdened by history. Outside, the blurred faces of prophets and saints watched from distant paintings, their expressions unreadable, shadows behind the holy glow. The priest's voice droned on, emphasizing consent, yet somewhere in the quiet corners of the room, doubt flickered like a faint candle's flame, an ironic twist of human machination, that hopes could be codified into law, and yet remain fragile as whispered secrets. The moment felt both solemn and oddly resigned, a ritual of expectation and quiet resignation. Later, in the calm of an evening, lanterns glow. Isolde and Sir Roland sat near the hearth, the flickering fire casting soft shadows on weathered wood. Their quiet contemplation was interrupted only by the crackle of burning logs and the faint scent of herbs drying on a nearby rack. They exchanged small, knowing glances, neither overly hopeful nor entirely resigned, caught in the slow, mutual understanding that life in this era was a mosaic of small compromises. The laws and rituals pressed upon them like an old, familiar blanket worn thin in places, but still offering some warmth. In these moments of calm, there was a strange, subdued sense of peace, an acceptance that human dreams, like the flickering flame, could be both bright and easily smothered by the steady hand of time and tradition. In quiet reflection, the long view stretched ahead, an imperfect human story of duties, hopes, and the silent irony that beneath centuries of law and custom, small human hearts beat with stubborn whispers of longing. The faces of prophets now faded into the blurred edges of memory, their silent witness a reminder that even sacred symbols are layered with human imperfections. The laws had woven a tapestry of land, lineage, and social order, yet somehow managed to leave room for the quiet, unspoken desire, the simple hope that someday, somewhere, love might find its small, discreet place within the folds of everyday life. As they drifted into sleep, the world outside moved slowly on, unhurried and quietly indifferent, just as it had for centuries, waiting patiently for stories to unfold, one small, mundane moment at a time. In the quiet corners of medieval towns, young Isolde and Roland considered their future with tentative hope. The days passed slowly, filled with the murmur of market voices and the distant toll of church bells, as they sought the permission and the blessing that might seal their union. Their modest ambitions were gently nudged along by the local clergy, who insisted that consent wasn't just a matter of hearts, but also of families, and the oversight of a bishop whose face remained unseen. shadowed behind veiled windows of authority. It seemed a simple desire to marry and build a life in the light of shared affection. Yet the world around them held silent rules and muffled voices that complicated every step. Love in those days was quietly kept within the boundaries, diligently drawn by tradition, law, and expectation, each whispering a reminder of what was considered proper and lawful. But the quiet harmony was soon disturbed by the arrival of a rival suitor backed by a nobleman, whose influence cast a long shadow over the hopeful couple. The noble's interest was not merely personal but strategic, and his backing made the path to legal acknowledgement more treacherous. As Isolde and Roland pressed on, they found themselves entangled in the labyrinth of canon law, with its endless signatures, relics of ancient decrees, and the unwritten tension of premarital intimacy that could tarnish or doom their plans altogether. The small voices of clerics and scribes measured and debated, often in muted, hurried tones that made the love-struck couple feel as if their words could be lost in a chamber of echoes. The more they tried to find a way forward, the clearer it became that their love was not only a matter of the heart, but also a delicate, often absurd performance in the grand theater of medieval legality. Irony echoed softly in the corridors of their hopes, as the same church that vowed to sanctify their union appeared to weigh every gesture and whispered promise with meticulous suspicion. Their discreet meetings, once filled with simple touches and shared glances beneath a broad oak, now seemed vulnerable to scandal, a scandal of premarital intimacy that sat uneasily alongside the church's insistence on purity and proper conduct. Yet the faces of prophets or saints behind the stained glass windows remained blurred, as if silently amused by the human efforts to impose order on what was essentially fleeting and imperfect. The couple's love, meanwhile, persisted in quiet defiance, threaded through the mundane routines of daily life, touching hands across a bustling market stall, exchanging faint smiles under the watchful eyes of clerics, whose faces could not quite be seen in the shifting light. It was a slow, gentle reminder that love often endures in the faint cracks of formal laws and rigid customs. Eventually, calm settled over Isolde and Roland as they recognized the slow, inevitable nature of their struggle. The rivalry faded into background noise. The noble's influence waned like a sunset behind distant hills. In the stillness that followed, they learned to accept the limits and absurdities of the laws that bound them, finding quiet solace in moments shared without expectation of official approval. The laws, with their intricate weave of canon texts and noble interests, seemed less like barriers and more like aged shadows cast on the ground by distant, unseeing figures. Their love, modest and unassuming, persisted in the simple act of waiting and wishing, an ordinary human story woven into the rustling of leaves and the gentle passing of days that combined to make a life. No matter how small or complicated, looking back, the tale of Isolde and Roland echoed softly through history, not as a grand saga, but as a quiet reflection on human stubbornness and the subtle humor woven into the fabric of law and tradition. Their love endured, not because of the laws that tried to define it, but in spite of them, quietly resisting the endless layers of rules and expectations. The blurred faces of prophets and saints served as silent witnesses, not judging, simply observing the slow, inevitable drift of human desire, expressed in everyday acts of patience and hope. In this calm, timeless space, their story found a gentle, enduring place, reminding us that beneath the weight of law and custom, human love simply persists softly in the in-between moments of quiet life. In a quiet corner of the duchy, a girl named Isolde dared to share stolen moments with Roland, a humble peasant, beneath the flickering shadow of an ancient oak. Their glances, soft and fleeting, stirred no alarm at first, merely a quiet defiance of the rigid boundaries that largely kept their worlds apart. It was an unremarkable universality. Two young hearts leaning into something forbidden, yet tender, whispering in the rustle of leaves and the slow drip of a nearby stream. The village folks, wrapped in routine, noticed only the faintest flicker of curiosity, muffled under layers of daily chores and cautious smiles. But beneath their quiet approval, others began to murmur, an unease crackling like dry leaves against the wind, warning that what was protected by silence could soon be threatened by fear. As word of the affair seeped through the tapestry of village gossip, the lord's face grew stern and distant, lips pressed into a line that betrayed both concern and icy resolve. An edict was soon proclaimed. Marriages crossing class lines were declared unlawful, and the lovers' clandestine meetings became acts of moral defiance. The inescapable logic of the law cast a shadow over their fragile hope, turning private longing into a public question of bloodlines and morality. Accusations arose, some whispering of incest, others warning of sacrilege. The boundary between love and shame grew razor sharp in the minds of those who watched. Irony lingered bitterly in the air, as the laws meant to preserve order now threatened to unravel because of a simple human desire for connection. In the courtroom, the faces were blurred and the voices subdued, yet the sense of absurdity was undeniable. Justice, draped in heavy robes, weighed down by its own rigidity. Isolde and Roland sat apart, their eyes quietly meeting through the sea of formal disapproval, knowing that their love was no worse than the many that came before it, just less legitimate in the eyes of those in power. The officials, with faces hidden in shadow or behind light-blurred masks of authority, debated endlessly about blood purity and social purity, their words cold and distant like the late evening air. The law, with its exaggerated seriousness, missed the quiet pulse of human longing beneath its layers of parchment and penalty. In this slow, muffled struggle, a faint flicker of irony persisted, that an act so simple as loving could threaten the peace of the entire duchy. Time passed, and the days found their slow rhythm, Isolde and Roland drifting through their routines with a cautious calm, almost as if in acceptance of the invisible veil cast between them. The laws lingered like a distant hum, sometimes seeming as exhausted as the aging stone walls of the manor. Their silent love continued in small, hidden gestures, a touch of fingers beneath worn fabric, a shared glance over a loaf of bread. It was as if the world had resigned itself to the quiet persistence of ordinary life, where love, despite all, managed to find its small places in the cracks of tradition. The absurdity of laws that tried to contain human complexity settled into a kind of slow, gentle humor, an acceptance that perhaps love was too human and too unruly to be contained entirely. Here, in this calm, the story nodded quietly toward its own subtle irony. In the end, the story of Isolde and Roland was woven into the fabric of the times, a reminder that even rigid laws cannot fully silence human longing. Reflecting on their quiet rebellion, one might see it as a witness to the resilience of simple human connection, an act both ordinary and extraordinary in the slow unfolding of history. The laws, now distant and hollow, serve as gentle shadows in the background of shared lives, quietly shaping the contours of what could or should be. Perhaps in their modest defiance lies a subtle lesson that beneath the layers of law and norm, human beings continue to seek understanding and companionship, even when the world tries to impose silence and separation. As the ages drift forward, the blurred faces and faint whispers remain, softly reminding us of the quiet, ironical endurance of love. In the quiet corridors of medieval courts, a summons was often a slow, inevitable thing, an invitation to witness the fragile intersection of law and human longing. On this particular day, two lovers found themselves at the center of attention, standing stiffly before the Duke's stern gaze, and the shadowed, unseen face of the bishop, whose features blurred behind a flickering candle. The air was thick with the scent of old wood wax and uncertain hopes, as heavy stone walls bore silent witness to their quiet shame. Yet beneath their formal attire and the weight of statutes, there lingered a shared, gentle defiance, an unspoken awareness that love's quiet persistence could slip even through the cracks of ancient decrees. Perhaps, in some distant corner of the room, a faint alarm stirred, unvoiced, waiting to be heard amidst the slow droning of history's unyielding march. As the court's tension grew, silent as a deep water well, the Duke's voice rose with a measured edge, warning of exile and demand for conformity, his words cutting through the stillness like a faint breeze. Meanwhile, the bishop's face, shadowed and indifferent, threatened to blur into the background. Yet his quiet authority seemed to push insistently from the shadows. The lovers stood motionless, their hands almost touching, but never quite joining, as the weight of old laws pressed heavy upon their shoulders. The room felt smaller with each command, the silent clash of power and tradition ringing softly in the quiet, as if history itself was holding its breath. And behind it all, in the silent corners of that ancient space, a quiet irony in the ritual of judgment lingered like a faint crack in an old plaster wall. Amidst the tension, a quiet voice emerged, a lawyer, perhaps weary but steady, pointing out that marriage was more than statutes scrawled in dusty scrolls. It was the subtle, honest exchange of hearts. His words drifted softly into the space, absurdly simple, suggesting that true bonds might need something beyond laws and decrees, a whisper of consent, a touch of mutual understanding. The Duke's brow furrowed slightly, as if the very idea was some distant echo from a forgotten age, and the bishop's face remained hidden by shadow, unreadable but contemplative. It was a moment that seemed both impossible and inevitable, like a ripple in a still pond, hinting that even in these distant halls, human experience might still find room for kindness, or at least for a quiet reconsideration. Perhaps, in the slow unfolding of this legal and moral moment, some small hope was quietly threading itself through the cracks. A gentle calm seeped into the room as the advocate's words settled, and the heavy air seemed to ease slightly, perhaps in acknowledgement of the slow, human truth that even the oldest laws are shaped by the imperfect, tender human hearts they seek to control. The lovers remained in place, breathing quietly, their faces faintly illuminated by the flickering candlelight, a mirror of the fragile, flickering hope that love could survive amidst the weight of tradition. The Duke's threats and the bishop's shadows lingered, yet somehow seemed less insistent, distant noises in a landscape of muted resolve. Outside, the world continued slowly turning, indifferent, and yet somehow more aware of what was quietly happening within these stone walls. A small human gesture of acknowledgement amidst an ocean of authority and silence. In the gentle aftermath of the scene, one might reflect on the quiet collision of old ideas and human stories. How laws, much like the faded tapestries on the walls, are woven from threads of morality, tradition, and gradually shifting understandings. The lovers walked away in a slow, deliberate silence, their steps echoing softly along the cold stone floor, carrying with them a weight of quiet courage and cautious hope. The court, with its blurred faces and unseen judgments, remained still, untouched by the restless passage of human hearts seeking recognition. This slow, unremarkable day, like countless others before it, added a faint, peaceful hue to a long, complex tapestry of human effort, reminding us that sometimes, even in the most solemn moments, life continues quietly, almost patiently, in its endless search for understanding. In the quiet, dimly lit chambers of medieval courts, formal declarations about marriage sometimes unfolded like ordinary conversations, marked by hesitant gestures and the slow turning of pages. The old laws hovered, often unspoken, but felt tethers that bound couples in silence, or occasionally in quiet rebellion. For villagers and nobles alike, marriage was usually a matter of alliances and social convenience, rather than love or personal choice. When the trial of old restrictions concluded, the decree that followed seemed soft, like a breeze stirring beneath heavy fabrics, allowing some gentle negotiations about dowries to take the betrothed's wishes into account. Feelings remained largely muted, but the wheels of change stirred sluggishly within the stone walls, hinting at a future where voices might someday be heard more clearly. It was, after all, a slow dawn, marked by small victories rather than loud triumphs. As negotiations stretched into the following months, tension softly rippled through communities, an awareness that marriage could be, at least in small ways, a shared decision rather than an unalterable decree. Isolde and Roland, two young souls caught in the cautious optimism of this new approach, agreed to marry with a measure of mutual consent that was seldom considered before. Their families, operating from a pragmatic place, discussed dowries over cups of stale bread and cups of thin wine, often with a grip that betrayed hope for more personal freedom. Yet, the old restrictions did not vanish completely. Restrictions on cross-class unions still cast a faint shadow, causing quiet debates about status and tradition. Nonetheless, the air was subtly different in it. An odd sense of patience mingled with the faint irony of progress. However tentative, the irony of the situation was not lost on those observing from afar. How laws so slow and heavy came to be gently nudged into a softer shape, like a worn cloth being stitched anew. The official proclamation that couples could negotiate weddings with the consent of the bride and groom somehow felt almost incidental, as if the authorities had shrugged at the edges of their own rules. Meanwhile, in small villages, couples like Isolde and Roland celebrated with modest ceremonies, their sing-song voices occasionally breaking the quiet of dawn as they finally exchanged vows beneath an unremarkable, sunlit altar. The edges of tradition, once sharp and unyielding, were now smudged and softened by hesitation and humor, some elders whispering that perhaps laws were more about appearances than real authority. Life carried on with the slow, gentle irony of humans, adjusting to new but fragile notions of choice. Under the calm light of the emerging day, the world seemed to settle, an atmosphere of quiet reflection falling over courts, marketplaces, and hearths. The struggles of old restrictions slowly dissolved into everyday routines, where couples began to walk together with a slightly lighter step, even if some bonds of class and law still lingered. For Isolde and Roland, the sun's rays touching the stone altar felt like a visible nod from history, an almost imperceptible shift, a subtle acknowledgement that love and permission, at least modestly, could coexist. The laws, like the people bound by them, had learned patience. They had adjusted to the slow rhythm of change, no longer rushing, but never halting entirely. And as the days grew warmer, the faint hope of future generations making choices for themselves shimmered, quiet and persistent, in the hazy background of everyday life. Looking back, it was a small milestone, a quiet turning point in the long, uneven journey of human rights and social norms. The marriage laws of medieval Europe, with their layered restrictions and cautious allowances, finally showed signs of fatigue, like an old man finally lowering his walking stick after a long day. The stories of Isolde and Roland, and others like them, became part of that slow tide of change, tiny ripples in the vast pond of history. Their simple act of walking toward a sunrise-lit altar held more meaning than it seemed at the moment. It was a reflection of human imperfection and hope, wrapped in a modest ritual. Perhaps, in the end, laws and norms are only as strong as the stories that quietly reshape them, stories of patience, humor, and the unspoken understanding that life, like sleep, takes its own gentle time to unfold. In the gentle silence of a 12th century cathedral town, the mornings unfolded with the soft clang of bells and the faint rustle of robes as the local clergy gathered in the stone-built hall to discuss matters of moral order. Bishop Aldrich, a figure whose face was often shrouded in shadow and light, listened carefully as scribes laid out new guidelines meant to shape the hearts and behaviors of townspeople. The church's influence grew quietly, like a comforting shadow stretching across daily routines, whispering authority into the smallest acts of life. It was an era when the line between sacred duty and mundane humanship blurred, and everyone knew the church's voice was an unavoidable part of their quiet, predictable days. Even in their imperfect attempts, there was a strange steadiness in this slow, unchallenged oversight, a reflection of humanity's persistent, if awkward, search for moral clarity amid ordinary existence. As the months passed, the tension subtly built. Whispers of dissent wove through the narrow streets, like the faint echoes of footsteps on stone. The clergy, diligently compiling penitential manuals and sermon guidelines, found themselves caught between authority and the human tendency to forget or overlook ideals. The manuals, thick with rules and procedures, seemed almost comical in their earnest attempt to catalog every potential mistake, like trying to tame a restless breeze with a single, stiff cloth. Clergy members occasionally exchanged amused glances beneath their veiled faces, aware of the irony in policing passions that often simmered quietly just beneath the surface. The societal scaffolding was firm, yet fragile in its own quiet, unspoken ways, as human imperfections stubbornly persisted despite the best efforts of clerical oversight. Sometimes, the more earnest the church's efforts appeared, the more evident the quiet absurdity became hidden behind the blurred faces of prophets and saints, their figures touched by a diffuse light that made them seem unknowable, distant, almost indifferent. Penitential manuals grew thicker, footnotes crowded with technicalities about sins and redemption, as if human morality could be neatly boxed in ink and parchment. The clergy's role shifted gradually from spiritual guides to inspectors of conduct, their gestures slow and deliberate, as if measuring the weight of every word or glance. Amid all this, the townspeople carried on with a strange mix of compliance and quiet amusement, knowing that human passions were often too awkward or too small to fully contain, like a child's nervous giggle at the edge of a serious meeting. The irony lingered. In trying to enforce morality, the human messiness persisted in subtle, often unnoticed ways. With passing years, the bustling daily life of the town found a tentative calm, where the church's influence settled into the background like a familiar tune that everyone silently hummed. The clergy sat in familiar chapels, poring over texts and occasionally exchanging weary, amused glances about the rarity of perfect adherence. The manuals, now weathered with age, served more as symbols of effort than precise blueprints, reminders that even the most meticulously crafted rules could not entirely tame human nature. Still, there was a strange comfort in this slow, unending attempt at order, like a long, quiet conversation that began centuries ago and persisted into the present. The faces behind the blurred saints remained unseen, but their silent watchfulness seemed to soften, becoming part of the background hum of daily life. Here, amidst simple routines and muted conversations, a gentle reflection settled. Humans are imperfect, and perhaps that is perfectly human after all. Looking back across those centuries, the story of the Church's role in regulating sexuality emerges as a patchwork of subtle efforts and quiet ironies, an ongoing dance between authority and human nature. The clerics, shadows of authority with their earnest, tired faces, aimed to impose order while knowing deep down that human passions often defy such efforts. The cathedral's stones witnessed countless small acts, hushed confessions, hesitant glances, shared smiles, each one a testament to the imperfect humanity that the Church sought to guide, but perhaps could never fully contain. In a way, the slow unfolding of these moral frameworks reminds us that morality, like all human endeavors, is perhaps best appreciated in its gentle, flawed persistence. The silent faces of saints continue to watch, blurred but present, as the quiet history of human imperfection trudges peacefully on. In the quiet corners of medieval towns, priests like Father Matteo would often sit at their wooden desks, their hands resting on worn parchment, contemplating the long shadows cast by flickering candles. It was a time when the act of confession became a ritual for many, a simple moment of truth, or sometimes an obligatory ritual that carried the weight of moral necessity. Peasants would shuffle in, their faces a mixture of mild embarrassment and habitual routine, whispering sins into the muffled air. For some, it was a chance to seek forgiveness. For others, a small relief from the burdens of everyday life. All the while, the gentle ticking of an old clock marked the slow, steady passage of quiet, unremarkable hours. As the years wore on, the Church's influence seeped deeper into daily customs, mandating confession for behaviors that had once floated silently in local gossip or seasonal dances. Priests began to record sins of fornication and illicit unions, a ledger of human frailty that grew thicker with each passing season. The local lords listened with a detached sense of curiosity, their voices thin and distant, debating whether to heed the Church's strict rules or allow old ways to persist in secret corners. Peasants, some weary and others resigned, exchanged knowing glances during harvest festivals, aware that confessional regulations had complicated their simple, lively traditions. Yet beneath this tension, life persisted quietly, sometimes humorously, in the cracks between ecclesiastical authority and local human warmth. There was a quiet irony in the way clergy, like Father Matteo, often blotted out by the shadows of their own solitude, meticulously recorded every lapse, every forbidden union, as if their ledger could contain the chaos of human desire. The prescribed rules sometimes clashed softly with the imperfect realities of village life, where passion flickered unexpectedly and secrets curled in darkened doorways. The cleric's pen hovered over the parchment, perhaps more tired than judgmental, illustrating the slow, steady struggle to define what was right in a world so infused with personal complication. The blurred face of a distant prophet seemed to loom silently behind these acts, their serious gaze lost in the diffuse light of the church's interior, as if watching human conventions unfold with a faint, amused detachment. In time, there was a calm that settled over these evolving traditions, a mutual, unspoken acknowledgement that human nature would always find subtle ways around rules. The community's routines adjusted, whispered conversations replaced overt confessions, and discreet glances shielded stories best left untold. The priests continued their work, their pens slowly tracing the outlines of human imperfections, while the lords and peasants alike accepted the quiet irony that nothing truly commanded desire, only regulated it. The shadows of the confessional and the faint glow of candlelight became background to everyday life, blending into the rhythm of ordinary days. Amidst this, a certain peace persisted in the mundane persistence of life's small, unquiet truths. Looking back, it's clear that the church's role in regulating medieval sexuality was perhaps less about morality and more about framing human intimacy within familiar, manageable boundaries. The silent, blurred faces of prophets, the dusty ledgers, the soft shuffle of feet in stone hallways, all speak slowly of a society grappling with its own contradictions, trying to impose order on something inherently restless. Humanity's imperfections wove themselves into the fabric of daily existence, quietly resisting complete control, yet never quite escaping the gentle, patient oversight of tradition. And so, in the slow, unyielding passage of time, these stories settled into the background of history, small, imperfect, quietly enduring, much like the soft hum of early evening at the end of any ordinary day. In a quiet village nestled beneath a tarnished sun, a young serf girl named Aline found herself caught in a quiet moment with Sir Rowan. A night whose gaze lingered just a little too long on her. Their stolen exchanges in the shadows of communal chores seemed insignificant at first, mere flashes of human curiosity amid daily routines. Yet, the old stones and the distant bells kept watch, quietly recording the small defiance of two ordinary lives drawn together by chance, or perhaps by some fragile tenderness. It was a simple romance, woven into the slow tapestry of village life, unnoticed except by the unspoken glances that passed between them amid the shifting seasons. The winds carried whispers, but nothing yet concrete, only the faint, slow heartbeat of forbidden hope setting in. As days grew into weeks, the secret between Alin and Sir Rowan began to ripple through the quiet fabric of their world, like a pebble dropped softly into a well. Rumors, small and almost inaudible, wove their way around the village, stirring under the soft pressure of gossip mongers and curious ears. The local priest, a man shadowed by the moving light of stained glass, summoned them silently to a tribunal. Their quiet romance was no longer a private matter, but a public crisis, an edge where morality and law blurred with the slow, relentless passage of canon law. The tension was palpable not in shouts or accusations, but in the hushed, measured tones of authority and the cautious glances exchanged by others who wondered just how thin the thread on which their fate now rested really was. When the day of the tribunal arrived, the scene unfolded with a certain dull routine wooden benches, the faint shuffling of feet, the echoes of a distant bell. Alin sat stiffly, her hands trembling slightly, while Sir Rowan kept his eyes fixed softly on the stone floor, as if willing it to swallow the weight of the moment. The clerk read aloud the formal charges: thy illicit affection and breach of societal order, before the obscure truths were laid bare beneath garbled words and whispered accusations. The whole affair seemed oddly mundane in its cadence, a slow, measured dance of law and penance, somehow solemn and ironic in its formality. No dramatic confessions, just quiet acceptance of the norms that kept such secrets cloaked beneath layers of ritual and quiet shame. After the hearing, Alin and Sir Rowan were sent back into the village with a measured sentence, acts of penance, perhaps some public acknowledgement, a small ritual of shame that would fade into the next sunset. The village, with its muted colors and persistent routines, seemed to breathe a collective sigh, a calm passing after the storm of accusations. The lovers retreated into separate corners of their worlds, their silent gestures now tinged with gentle resignation. Life moved on, markets, chores, the distant hum of daily labor, each person carrying the quiet memory of the scandal, like a small shadow cast by passing clouds. The The storm had passed, yet the slow, steady heartbeat of moral order persisted in the background, unchallenged and patiently unchanging. Later, beneath the soft, unassuming sky, Alin and Sir Rowan found small solace in the familiarity of ordinary days, waiting by wells, sewing at their benches, moments punctuated by the distant, unseen faces of prophets whose images flickered like shadows behind veiled windows. Their story, a gentle ripple in the steady stream of history, whispered quietly through the ages, an illustration of how lives, no matter how mundane or forbidden, are still woven into the slow, accepting cloth of societal rules. The church's role was not loud or dramatic, but subtle like the worn pages of a dusty book, easily overlooked, yet quietly shaping what was considered right or wrong. Perhaps, in the end, the greatest lesson was the shared stillness, an understanding that some stories are not meant to be loud, but quietly endured, softly remembered in the gentle flow of time. In the quiet corners of medieval towns, clerics and villagers often moved through their days under the watchful eye of the church's gentle but persistent presence. It was a time when moral codes were woven into daily routines, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior, especially concerning sexuality, were quietly reinforced through sermons, signage, and the subtle shaping of community standards. Tales of sinners and saints blurred into the same dusty air. Faces of sacred prophets remained unseen, cloaked in shadows, or softened by morning light. In these small, ordinary moments, the church's influence was quietly tangible, shaping the rhythm of life without much fuss or fanfare. But tension often drifted beneath the surface, as whispers of dissent or curiosity stirred among those who dared question the strict norms. Occasionally, a heretical pamphlet or a forbidden idea found its way into the hands of a restless thinker, its crinkled paper crackling softly in the quiet corners of a scriptorium. Or under the weight of a heavy cloak, the authorities, ever alert, would notice the faint rustle of suspicion, and the flicker of fear would pass silently through the community. These moments of quiet rebellion, however small, threatened to disturb the delicate balance of order that the church maintained with gentle authority, reminding everyone that the line between conformity and chaos was thin and easily crossed. One day, in a dim, cool chamber, the tension reached its modest climax. Bishop Aldrich, with his face partly hidden by a shadow and his dark eyes calm but firm, listened as the accused presented their case, an unassuming pamphlet challenging clerical authority. The air was thick with the scent of old ink and wax candles, the silence punctuated only by the rustling of parchment. As the bishop's voice slowly announced the verdict, it was clear that the church's notions of order would be reinforced once again. Punishments would be meted out, and the heretical text would be consigned to the flames. The scene was quietly decisive, a solemn reminder of the church's capacity to wield both spiritual and secular power with gentle inevitability. The proceedings drew toward a calm, almost mundane close. The crowd dispersed slowly, some faces betraying a hint of relief, others a resigned gaze that seemed to accept the slow, steady pulse of authority. The burned pamphlet left behind a faint wisp of smoke, vanishing into the cool, dwindling light of the late afternoon. Life continued unhurried, people kneeling in prayer, children playing, or artisans setting down their tools. Each small act carried the weight of centuries of tradition. As the shadows lengthened and the church bells tolled softly, a quiet sense of routine settled over the community, threaded with the faint irony that even in opposition, the rhythm of life mirrored the unyielding march of time. Reflecting on these moments from the distant calm of history's slow currents, one notices how human imperfection and the desire for order have intertwined beyond the voices of prophets and kings. The church's role in shaping morality, often through quiet means, reveals a story not only of power, but also of common humans navigating the boundaries of their own restraint and curiosity. Faces, sometimes unseen, now seem almost indifferent, blurry witnesses to a shared, unending human endeavor. To understand, to control, and to quietly, endlessly adapt. Perhaps in these slow, contemplative acts, there lies a certain peaceful absurdity, a reminder that, at some fundamental level, life always continues, softly, stubbornly, with gentle irony. In the slow, amber glow of a medieval village, the daily routine carried on as it had for generations, with the church's presence subtly woven into the tapestry of human life. Facial expressions were often concealed behind hoods or shadows, leaving behind only the gentle ripple of hands or the faint whisper of cloth against stone. People went about their simple tasks, tending fields, preparing meals, exchanging quiet greetings, while the distant, unchanging figure of the church tower loomed above, silent and unyielding. It was an existence both ordinary and wrapped in quiet expectation, where morality was woven into the fabric of each passing day. And amid this steady rhythm, the church's voice, soft yet persistent, echoed through every corner, shaping the unspoken rules of affection and desire. As years traced their slow, unrelenting path, tensions began to stir beneath the surface, small, almost imperceptible cracks in the veneer of community life. The church's directives on sexuality grew more detailed. Whispers of punishment and penitence wafted through the air like faint incense, and secret glances became acts tinged with anxiety. Pilgrims and townsfolk alike sometimes paused in moments of quiet reflection, wondering if the boundaries they had to respect were truly humane, or simply a distant echo of divine judgment. The faces of prophets or saints, often blurred behind veils of shadow, seemed to watch silently, unmoved by human frailty, as morality's iron grip tightened just a bit. An ironic stillness settled. How deeply human longing was entwined with the very structures meant to contain it. Yet, amidst the rigidity, a subtle irony blossomed silently. The Church's well-intentioned efforts to regulate human intimacy often merely highlighted its persistent limits. Reforms arrived not with thunder, but as quiet gestures, marriage counseling sessions conducted by priests, nuptial rites carefully scheduled and controlled, softening the edges of strict discipline into something more humane. The community's breath slowed, and some realized that control could coexist with a kind of gentle understanding, even if it sometimes felt like a careful dance or a game of patience. The faces of sacred figures, now blurred less sharply, seemed to watch over these small acts of kindness, offering a faint sense of reassurance amidst the ongoing tension. Life moved forward, softly balancing human imperfection and institutional intent, as if trying to find a gentle peace where none had existed before. In this calm, a shared quiet emerged, an acknowledgement that perhaps morality was as much about understanding as about enforcing rules. The community, with its worn hands and slow steps, began to navigate the delicate terrain of love and duty with a new patience, steering between oversight and mercy. The Church's reforms, more compassionate, less punitive, added a layer of subtle grace to everyday life. A handshake after a disagreement, a whisper of encouragement in a quiet prayer. The faces of prophets, now faintly visible behind the shifting light, seemed to smile just a little, if such divine expressions could be perceived, at this modest act of human endurance. The slow turning of seasons brought new routines, less driven by fear, and more by a cautious hope that human complexity could find space within sanctified boundaries. Thus, in the slow, measured rhythm of the village life, a quiet reflection settled. Perhaps morality was never meant to be absolute, but rather a gentle guiding hand that adapted with human rhythms. The Church's role, once one of strict oversight, evolved into that of a subtle caregiver, still distant, yet listening, still serene, but imbued with small acts of compassion. The faces faded into the background, replaced by everyday scenes of people living, loving, forgiving, imperfect, small-hearted, quietly hopeful. And in this softened realm, echoes of mercy lingered faintly, like a lullaby for restless souls, whispering that perhaps, even in human imperfection, there was a kind of peace to be found. The stories, slow and unhurried, drifted quietly into time's faint horizon, leaving only the gentle hum of a world trying to be kind. In the quiet corner of a modest 13th century village, Myra, the baker's daughter, watched the morning sun flicker across the uneven cobblestones as she handed a freshly baked loaf to Tomas, the young blacksmith's apprentice. Their eyes met briefly, cheeks warming beneath their coarse woolen hoods, while the low murmur of village life carried on clucking chickens, distant hammering, and the faint clang of the town bell. The exchange was simple, yet within it lay an unnoticed spark of something that might stir in the stillness of routine, passing unnoticed by most, but not by them. The villagers, bound tightly by unspoken rules, barely saw the shy glances and lingering smiles. Love was there, quietly woven into everyday gestures, like threads in a well-worn cloth. Life moved slowly, the edges of their world softened by the humdrum comfort of shared daily chores and silent longings. As the days lengthened, Myra and Tomas found themselves lingering a moment longer at the market stall, or glancing aside when they crossed paths, their quiet thrill growing in stolen looks that felt both forbidden and inevitable. Rumors of their brief exchanges trickled through the village, carried on the wind as idle gossip that everyone nodded at, but pretended to ignore, eyeing the sky or the church steeple instead. The clergy, ever watchful with their half-shut eyes, and unseen faces hidden behind shadowed arches, kept the moral order secure, yet couldn't entirely suppress the subtle pulse of budding affection in the village square. There were no declarations, only small acts, an extra loaf, a quick hand on a roughened arm, fleeting smiles under wide-brimmed felt hats, insinuating love among the unspoken rules. Irony, it seemed, had quietly turned love into a quiet game of patience, played out amid ordinary days. One afternoon, Tomas brought Myra a small, unadorned iron charm he had forged in secret, the edges slightly uneven, and handed it over with a nervous shrug, as if the object alone could contain their buried hopes. The gesture was both sweet and tinged with irony, an outsider's token, flawed and imperfect, much like the feelings they dared not name aloud. Their world, candid and mundane, seemed slow to acknowledge the intimacy blooming between routine interactions and silent gestures. The village watched and waited unmoved, as if life itself had grown accustomed to such delicate whispers. The shadowy figures of prophets and saints, their faces blurred behind veils or light, observed quietly from a distance, untouched by mortal dramas, but silently admiring the patience of simple hearts. In their shared, unspoken longing, Myra and Tomas found a rare, fragile calm, one that drifted amidst chores and idle chatter, like fog settling over tranquil fields. In the lull of evening, when the village settled into a gentle hush, and the scent of baking bread mingled with the cool air, Myra and Tomas sat side by side on a worn wooden bench outside the tavern, their shoulders almost touching, but bodies still cautious. Words were unnecessary, only the occasional glance or soft breath indicating the presence of something more tender than simple companionship. This peaceful quiet was their small universe, a pause between societal expectations and personal quiet listeners, where love existed quietly, almost unnoticed. The faces of the clergy remained unseen, their authority softened by the glow of dying daylight, or perhaps by their own silent, unexamined hopes. With no grand gestures, merely the rhythm of shared presence, the two found solace in the slow, unspoken understanding that love was perhaps most real when it rested in the calm between moments, in the spaces left untouched by storytelling or judgment. Looking back, they might have seen their love as just a flicker, brief, modest, easily overlooked. Yet it endured in the mundane and honest span of everyday life, like a gentle echo in a silent hall. The village, with its unchanging routines and watchful eyes, held their secrets softly, unable to grasp how ordinary acts could carry such quiet significance. Perhaps, in the end, that was the most human truth, that love's simplest forms often remain hidden in plain sight, quietly shaping lives without fanfare or firm resolve. The faces of prophets and saints, still concealed behind unseen veils, seemed to nod faintly in acknowledgement, humble witnesses to the patience of common hopes. And as the sun dipped below the distant trees, leaving the village bathed in a gentle, sleepy glow, one could almost believe that love, imperfect and understated, was enough to carry the slow rhythm of ordinary existence. In the quiet hours of dawn, Myra and Tomas often found themselves stealing fleeting glances behind the old granary, where the cool breeze carried whispers of a shared hope. Their secret meetings were simple, soft words, gentle touches on worn cloth, and promises woven between hurried breaths, moments suspended in the slow rhythm of the day. Around them, the village stirred, indifferent to the quiet rebellion unfolding just beyond sight, while the distant clatter of carts and murmuring gossip hinted at an invisible web tightening around their fragile hope. The morning light, dull but steady, seemed to both reveal and conceal their clandestine exchanges, like a faint outline of something forbidden but human. Despite the simplicity, there was an undeniable tenderness in those stolen moments, rooted in the ordinary, yet feeling irrevocably important. As the days wore on, the shadow of tension grew heavier. Whispers persisted among neighbors, and Myra's restless eyes betrayed her. The village held its breath every time she neared the church, where the ever-watchful parish priest's gaze seemed to linger a little longer than necessary, an unseen judge whose faces remained in shadow, faces that could never be trusted to reveal understanding. Tomas's hand, once casual and comforting, grew more guarded, yet neither could fully turn away from the quiet pull of longing. The knowledge of an approaching arranged marriage for Myra seemed almost a distant rumor, but was, in fact, a looming certainty, casting a pall over their secret world. Each glance was tinged with a mix of hope and despair, as if love itself was balancing precariously on the edge of obligation. There was a quiet irony to their situation, how human needs persisted despite the strict codes and heavy structures of daily life. Myra, with her delicate fingers and a soft blush that darkened when she spoke of Tomas, found humor in the absurdity of their secret, like two actors in a play with no critics but their own uncertain hearts. Tomas, ever patient, would chuckle softly under his breath when plans were interrupted, or when gossip filtered too close, knowing well the delicate fragility of their act. The village's slow, unchanging routines persisted around them, indifferent to the small rebellions of desire, like the way a candle flickers in a draught, unsteady but persistent. Here, in these mundane moments, the human comedy of love unfolded quietly, tinged with irony and soft humor that only the patient could observe. One late afternoon, as shadows lengthened and the air cooled with a faint hint of coming rain, Myra and Tomas sat side by side beneath a thinned-out tree. Their hands rested nearby, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of shared secrets. Their talk was subdued, a gentle exchange of hopes and fears, an acknowledgement that for now, peace lay in their silence. The world around them moved slowly. A cart creaked in the distance. A bird settled quietly on a branch, and the mundane rhythm returned to a calm, almost meditative state. The tension ebbed, replaced by a sense of acceptance, an understanding that love, in these quiet corners of their lives, was enough, even if only momentarily. The allure was in the stillness, the slow, deliberate presence of two gentle souls caught between duty and desire. Reflecting later, Myra and Tomas recognized that even these humble moments contained a quiet dignity, an affirmation that human life, in all its simplicity and imperfection, was worth quietly cherishing. Their secret world, guarded by shadows and whispered promises, was both a fleeting dream and a small act of rebellion against the quiet demands of their society. They understood, in that stillness, that love was perhaps less about grand gestures and more about enduring the slow, boring patience of everyday life. The faces of saints or prophets, blurred and unseen behind the church's light, seemed to watch silently, offering only the faintest hint of mercy. And so, slowly, they returned each to their roles, each carrying the quiet weight of memories and hopes, content in the gentle, imperfect rhythm of their ordinary love. As the late afternoon sun cast a warm, mottled glow over the village square, the harvest festival unfolded with casual cheer. Farmers and townsfolk moved slowly, their hands still dusty from the day's work, exchanging greetings amid the scent of bread and cider. Myra and Tomas, young and quietly smitten, seized a brief moment among the weaving dancers to exchange shy glances and whispered words, feeling the subtle thrill of stolen affection. It was a fleeting pause in the ordinary rhythm of farming life, a welcome breath of intimacy amid the day's chores. The air, warm and slightly damp with lingering sweat, seemed to hold their secret lightly before the old routines resumed once more. Later in the evening, the festival swayed into more boisterous revelry, with a traveling minstrel arriving to soften the darkness with song and laughter. His voice, rough yet melodic, wove through the crowd, catching the attention of Myra, whose eyes lingered on him longer than on Tomas beside her. Tomas, leaning against a rough-hewn table, felt a strange prick of jealousy rise, a quiet, almost distant sort of ache that he couldn't quite name. The minstrel's arrival was a reminder of how easily desire floated between the trivial and the profound, fluttering in and out like a moth near a candle. As the night deepened, the delicate balance of their quiet love began to tremble beneath the weight of other voices and unspoken doubts. Myra found herself watching Tomas in the glow of flickering lamps, her cheeks warm with lingering embarrassment, while simultaneously stolen glances toward the minstrel, whose smile seemed genuine, yet veiled with shadows. Tomas's jaw tightened subtly, caught between affection and a begrudging recognition of his own vulnerable pride. The crowd's echoing laughter and the shuffle of feet masked the faint tension that settled around them, weaving irony into the fabric of their simple lives. They understood, in some quiet corner of their minds, that desire often arrived unannounced, with no etiquette and no apologies, disrupting the calm like an errant breeze. The fleeting moment of harmony was quietly lost again amid the noise, leaving only the slow, lingering ache of unspoken feelings. As the festival's music waned and the villagers eased into more subdued conversations, Myra and Tomas found a small, shadowed corner to stand in, faces faintly illuminated by the dim glow of a lantern. There was no need for words, just the soft, measured breathing of two people trying to hold their fragile connection when outside forces seemed larger than their private hopes. Their eyes, now steadier, expressed the small regrets and gentle acceptance of human imperfection. The minstrel's melodies, the laughter, the scent of ripe apples, all faded into the quiet hum of the night, leaving behind a sense of peaceful resignation. Amidst the slow, calming hush, they understood that love was never fully tidy. It was just a slow, imperfect life happening quietly in the shadows, in the stillness that settled at dawn. With the sky a subtle blush of light, the village returned to its usual rhythm, carrying the faint echo of the night's quiet turbulence. Myra and Tomas, no longer bound by the immediate ache of jealousy or fleeting desire, moved through their day with a quiet awareness, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of love's fragile and imperfect nature. Perhaps, they thought, true contentment was not in grand declarations or perfect harmony, but in these small, slow recoveries from moments of insecurity. As folk went about their chores, the blurred faces of prophets and unseen elders seemed almost to nod sagely in approval, reminding them that everyone's private, mundane stories carried an unassuming weight of human grace. Life, they realized, was simply a series of these quiet, ordinary moments, each one fleeting and yet profoundly real. Under the faint glow of the moon, Tomas and Myra's quiet meeting in the abandoned chapel seemed like just another secret amid the gentle hum of village nights. Their whispered promises and the soft rustle of fabric marked a fleeting moment of personal intimacy tucked away from the everyday routine. The flickering candle, perched precariously on an old stone, cast uneven shadows that danced upon their faces, small human acts of affection amid an uncertain world. It was as ordinary as a pair of hands touching, and yet, in this sliver of time, it felt unusually precious. The night was silent save for the distant hoot of owls, indifferent to the quiet human stories unfolding beneath its cool gaze. But tranquility never lasted long in small villages, especially when light and shadow collide in unexpected ways. A sudden flicker of the candle, stirring with the night breeze, or perhaps the slight tremor of human breath, caught the attention of a nearby villager. The soft glow was noticed, then reported quickly, quietly, until it reached the ears of the village constable and eventually the local priest. As they approached the chapel, the night seemed to hold its breath. The faint scent of wax and straw hung heavily. Tomas and Myra, caught off guard, felt a ripple of tension ripple through them, their private world suddenly invading by figures of authority and suspicion. The constable, and the priest arrived with slow, deliberate steps, their faces obscured by the dim light. Yet their presence seemed oddly formal for what was clearly a small, human moment. Their eyes grew stern, the usual calm replaced by quiet admonition. They demanded explanations, their voices low but firm, as if their duty was to remind everyone of the invisible boundaries that defined the village life. Tomas and Myra's protests were muted as irony settled in. It was a simple candle's flicker, yet it had ignited a stir that threatened the fragile balance between private desire and community discipline. The absurdity of enforcing such morality on an ordinary night felt almost poetic, like watching a play long past its moment. After some tense exchanges, the mood gradually softened, settling into a subdued calm. The village authorities offered a ritual of penance, perhaps a simple apology or a silent bow, emphasizing their role as custodians rather than tormentors. Tomas and Myra, feeling the weight of the evening's absurd turn, complied with quiet nods. The candle's flame, now dim and flickering weaker, seemed to flick away the lingering tension in the cool night air. The village, somehow, returned to its slow, predictable rhythms, humble, weary, probably resigned. The night moved on, carrying the quiet reminder that even in the simplest acts, human lives often hovered between tenderness and tedious morality. As dawn broke softly onto the village, the memory of the night remained like a vague whisper, an exchange quietly forgotten, yet subtly remembered in the slow turn of days. Tomas and Myra turned to each other in the early morning light, their faces marked by a kind of mild amusement at the evening's irony. The candle's flicker, the confrontation, the moral code, each moment a small thread in the fabric of their lives, woven with ordinary love and casual transgressions. In the quiet stillness, human imperfections persisted, fragile and fleeting, yet somehow resilient. The village stirred, unaware of the quiet dramas that unfolded beneath its stable surface, as life gently pressed forward, patient and unremarkable. In a quiet village, the mornings began with the soft clang of a bell and the gentle stir of the marketplace. Myra, a young woman with a sheepish smile, lingered by her window, watching the dawn's pale light spill over the thatched roofs. Her family went about their routines, unaware of the quiet hope she harbored for Tomas, the local carpenter. Love in these small moments was often nothing more than a fleeting glance or a hurried word, yet within those subtle exchanges, a fragile thread of longing was already forming, quietly pulling her toward a future she dared not fully describe. As days passed, Myra's affection for Tomas grew into a silent tension, especially when their paths crossed by the well or in the market square. Friends and family noticed her blushes and hesitant smiles, though no one spoke of it aloud. Tomas, with hands that often held tools more than words, seemed to carry a gentle patience, yet his eyes betrayed a yearning that matched Myra's own. Between casual conversations and shared chores, they slipped into a rhythm filled with small touches and quiet hopes, treading carefully around the boundaries of social expectation and personal desire. The unspoken weight of their attraction added a subtle tension to everyday life, like a whispered secret held just below the surface of mundane routines. One late afternoon, Myra's family gathered in the humble hearthlit room, discussing the future with the cautious seriousness of the wary. When Myra's feelings surfaced in a hesitant plea, a trembling voice imploring her family to accept Tomas, there was a moment of silent disbelief, tinged with irony. An older sister raised an eyebrow, a father shifted uneasily, and the mother hesitated before finally relenting, more out of exhaustion than conviction. The family's reluctant acceptance was not born of joyous approval, but of necessity, and perhaps an understated recognition that love, however hidden or fraught, could weave quietly into the fabric of their modest lives. The air felt lighter, even if the questions still lingered quietly in the corners of their minds. The evening settled in softly, casting shadows across the worn wooden furniture and faded tapestries. Myra and Tomas found themselves sitting close by the fire, their shoulders almost touching, sharing a silence that was both calming and tentative. The world outside was slow and gray, but within their small space, time seemed to hold its breath. They spoke little, yet their glances carried weight. The warmth of shared understanding softened the earlier ironies and cautious hopes. It was in this peaceful, unassuming moment that they allowed themselves to accept the quiet blessing of a future they had once only dared to dream of in whispered hopes. The simplicity of their coexistence pressed gently against the passage of time, like fine cloth stitched with faint, persevering threads of dawn. Looking back, one might see their story not as a grand event, but as a quiet reminder. Love, in all its modest forms, can quietly thread through everyday life, enduring through patience and reluctant acceptance. Their footsteps, small and careful, left trails in the dust of a simple life that nevertheless held moments of genuine connection. As they drifted into sleep beneath a shared roof, the blurred faces of unseen prophets seemed to offer no judgment, only a faint, unseen encouragement toward ordinary hope. Perhaps these routines, spoken and unspoken, are what sustain, in the end, the quiet architecture of human hearts, modest and imperfect, but undeniably real.